All right. Um, in this presentation, I'll be talking about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson and the Radical Republican Party, just a general overview of them. So, first I'll talk about the impeachment and a bit of a general overview of Andrew Johnson. So, first, who was Andrew Johnson? He was born in Tennessee in 1808 and grew up in poverty because when he was around 3 years old, his father died. And because of the situation things were in back then, his mother didn't, she wouldn't make that much money, so he had to work from a very young age. When he was 17, he started his own tailor shop, and because he was such a hard worker and made so much money from such a young age, he built up a respectable political fan base of poorer white male Democrats, which means they were pro slavery because he was in Tennessee in 1808. Now we're on to how Andrew Johnson became president. Andrew Johnson gained the attention of the U.S. as the only Southern senator who publicly opposed the secession, saying, quote, "Damn the Negroes. I am fighting those traitorous aristocrats, their masters." Right? So his followers, since they are poor white males, they were like, yeah, no, screw the aristocrats. And, they were all racist, so they didn't care that much about the slaves, but they didn't like the aristocrats getting their way. And because of that loyalty to the Union, and because Abraham Lincoln wanted more votes, and Andrew Johnson had uh, a segment of people that Abraham Lincoln didn't really have popularity with, which were pro-slavery Southern Democrats, he ran for president with Andrew Johnson as his vice president. Unfortunately, Andrew Johnson was Abraham Lincoln's vice president for only 6 weeks until he was shot into presidency because of the Abraham Lincoln assassination. Now we're on to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. So, everyone really liked him as the vice president, but he has been considered one of the worst US presidents, up there with Trump and all that fun stuff. So he did face a couple of impeachment votes. There were 11 articles of impeachment brought against him, but only three of them actually went to the Senate and House and were voted on. He avoided removal by one vote three different times. And why were there votes against him? It's because he snuck Confederate states into the Union, and because he knew what he was doing, Congress wouldn't exactly love, right? So when Congress was on a long break from around his inauguration until December of that same year, he snuck a lot of Confederate states into the Union, ignoring the Test Oath Law, which required the Confederate senators who were running back then to swear that they had never aided the Union in any way. And after he snuck those Confederate states into the Union, he didn't give them that many restrictions, which was what a lot of Congress, which at the time was controlled by mostly radical Republicans, it's what they wanted. And some of the things that those Southern Confederate states that he rushed into the Union created, they were called black laws or black codes, which, among other things, didn't allow black people to join the militia or be on a jury, which it allowed every, I assume, white male at the time. I doubted they allowed women on the jury and certainly not in the militia. And they made it a criminal offense for black people to be out of job, to be unemployed. By unemployed, it's not just unemployed, it's not having a job that white people counted as a job. So you could see how very quickly this could turn into, oh, we're only going to recognize working on the farms under ex-slave masters. So you can see how pretty quickly how this technically avoided being slavery, but it was essentially legal slavery. All right, so we just spoke about the presidency of Andrew Johnson, and now I will give you a general overview of the Radical Republican Party. Different radical Republicans back then, not, as they are now. Now, radical Republicans are not fun. So, first, how did the Radical Republican Party emerge? They emerged from, in short, the passion of the Radical Republicans, with the House leader on the left looking like, kind of a zombie Abraham Lincoln without the sweet top hat, Thaddeus Stevens, and their leader in the Senate on the right, Charles Sumner, who looks still kind of like a zombie due to the black and white, but not like Abraham Lincoln. And so essentially how they emerged were just the passion of the pro-racial equality people back then, very similar to the people now, right? You can definitely think of passionate anti-racists, and maybe they weren't anti-racist back then, but they were, very close to it. Pro-racial equality is pretty close to anti-racism. And so an example of the passion of the leaders and just the general radical Republican Party was the what's called the caning of Charles Sumner. So he was giving just a little speech in a Senate meeting when he, in a sense, insulted. No, he did. He insulted one of the Democratic senators back then when he wasn't in the room, describing their pro slavery view as having a mistress who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean, the harlot slavery. So, back then, I don't know, back then, that's probably a pretty sick burn, right? Still, it's very tranquil by today's standards, but, you don't really see many senators, yo mama insulting someone. And I feel like this is a pretty decent equivalent to that back then. So he was very passionate. And when the Democratic senator heard about this next meeting, as you can see in the picture, he beat the ever living crap out of Charles Sumner. And now, what were the beliefs of the Radical Republican Party? And, did they do many things? Yeah, no, they definitely accomplished a fair bit. The beliefs of the Radical Republican Party were the opposite of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, as I spoke earlier about him facing the impeachment votes, they did not like what he did because they were pro-racial equality and they saw the black laws and the black codes as not furthering the idea of racial equality, which they weren't. So, because of the passion of the Radical Republican Party, they were able to kind of sweep over the states that were in the US back then and have a pretty solid majority of Congress and the Senate, a majority enough to almost impeach Andrew Johnson, but they weren't quite able to do it. And, a little quick thing of what they did was they passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, which, among other things, the 14th Amendment gave Black American citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gave Black citizens, right, they're now citizens, hooray, the right to vote. And unfortunately, the Radical Republican, they were great, right? They really changed the US and how we are today, I imagine. It seemed like they definitely spearheaded the pro-racial equality movement and desegregation and all that. I'm sure it's a lot of the same general people. But not all of them, as you can imagine, were super great people. Some people just kind of wanted to be in the majority and have power. There's a quote by a radical Republican at the time, Waitman T. Willie, who once wrote that the two races, except in the relation of slave and master, cannot exist in harmony. This isn't a normal radical Republican view, but it's very similar to Abraham Lincoln's view at the time, right? So why is this important? It's important because it's important for my grade, but it is definitely very interesting to see how quickly ideas changed post-Civil War and how quickly the anti-racism built up and kind of swept the nation. And they eventually had majority in the House and the Senate. Yeah, just important to see how quickly how this kind of started a lot of movements that you can think of today that were anti-racist. All right, so just real quick, here's a bibliography. You can see here all the sources I used. Can I move this circle? I can. Right, so here are all the sources I used. Look at that. And just a quick links to the images I used.